this. If I see Tammy.
Yeah, it sounded like
Love the snow. Okay, we can get going. Who was all on last week's contract training?
It was the inspection, right?
Yes, that was with Jared Guess, our inspector. He was a guest speaker. Just had a really great conversation around like the structure of a home inspection and what the buyer can expect during the home inspection. You know, just answering simple questions like how long it takes and, you know, kind of buyer's etiquette, agent's etiquette, you know, the process of follow-up inspections and how a inspector will point those out, you know, obviously during the inspection, but also in their report. We discussed the structure of an inspection report as well. So now this is kind of part 2 of that. And now that we've had the home inspection, now what's next for us as buyers agents, and how do we respond to the seller? What are the ways in which the inspection contingency can go? So we've had our home inspection. Let's see who's all here. So we've had the home inspection now. Now what? So again, the home inspection, it's a 3-pronged contingency. So you're having the home inspection itself, the inspection being done by a qualified professional Wisconsin registered inspector, that's someone like Jared, and then follow-up inspections recommended in the inspection report. So what do we do with that information? So now after we get that inspection report, when I'm coaching buyers through this process, we are now like entering into like our negotiation prep and information gathering phase. So now we are like gathering as much information about the repairs and conditions that have been presented to us in this inspection report, and then going and determining how we want to respond to the seller. So first is conversations with the buyer. So we're identifying what is material to the buyer. I'm always saying to agents that we need to also like discuss big picture when it comes to determining how we want to respond to the seller. I also have a note in here, delivering the inspection report right away to the listing agent. Once you receive that inspection report, it's very important just to deliver it right away to the listing agent. We want them to have a copy of this as soon as possible. I just think it's common courtesy to have everyone given the opportunity to read through the report. There are no surprises. When we go to present our requests to a seller or to the listing agent, we don't want a seller to be surprised in any way. And it does state in our offers that we will give prompt delivery of the inspection report to the seller. So prompt is vague. I say send it as soon as you receive it. back to big picture and identifying what is material to the buyer. You know, every single inspection report, you know, every single house obviously is going to have different things wrong with it. You know, if you're working on the east side, for example, you know, for those of us who work on the east side, going through inspection reports of these huge 100-year-old homes is very daunting. You know, the buyer's going to have questions, but we always want to focus on big defects here when we are focusing on how and what to ask of the seller in order to repair. A lot of this is going to also be informed by what the inspector recommends as a follow-up inspection. So, you know, for example, there might be recommended follow-up inspections on a foundation, on a roof, on the electrical system. So those, I think, right off the bat will help inform like how you and what you are going to identify as material to the buyer. We as buyer's agents need to be helping them through this process, as far as like helping to identify that, and doing our due diligence and getting these follow-up inspections scheduled. So my process always is I receive the report, buyers receive the report at the same time. I let them know, you know, obviously during the home inspection, we'll be able to identify those bigger ticket items that the inspector recommends having a follow-up inspection for. So, you know, when I am there in real time at the home inspection, if a inspector calls something out that he recommends needs follow-up inspection, I'm on the phone right away getting a contractor out to look at it. Because again, now too, we have a deadline that we are working up against. So we want to get those contractors in there right away. That was something that was discussed last week. Just insofar as like, you know, as newer agents start stockpiling contractor names and phone numbers. You know, we want to have people like in our trusted canon of people that we can go to when we want to have a follow-up inspection. So get a roofer, get a plumber that you trust. And I think it's good to have conversations with these contractors ahead of time saying, you know, I'm an agent. We, as part of our inspection process, we have follow-up inspections. Is that something that you do? You know, most contractors are willing to come out for free and give their opinion and give an estimate on what they think is going on. You know, they're also trying to earn business. So again, back to in real time, at the home inspection, another reason why it's important to be in attendance at your home inspections is to get those contractors called in a timely manner. So then, you know, after that, obviously we can start adding those to our list of things that we want to approach the seller with. But then we're going to receive this report and there might be other things buried in there or in the report that were not explicitly discussed at the home inspection itself. You know, so I'm always reading these reports. I'm giving the buyer the opportunity to read the report, and I'm always scheduling a time to talk, you know, probably within 12 hours after we receive these reports to kind of go over what else they might want to ask the seller of, and kind of going through and discussing, okay, these are the things that are important to me. Let's have a bigger conversation about it. So there are things, of course, that kind of, again, looking at that bigger picture, you know, Mr. Buyer, you know, I think we should focus on X, Y, and Z versus not necessarily focusing on this smaller item that could be taken care of pretty easily. And also in our big picture too, you know, especially in this climate, especially in this high demand climate, we want to be mindful of how we're approaching the sellers with this, just insofar as, you know, they probably do have more interest on their home. And I also have to laugh about all of this too, because we're also having this training at a time where a lot of inspections are not happening. So, so it's all big picture. So back to having that discussion, identifying what is material to the buyer, getting those follow-up inspections and receiving those opinions and those estimates. So, you know, again, we'll go back to our East Side home example. Let's say we're getting a opinion on a foundation repair and a roof repair and an electrical system. Once we have those follow-up inspections, now we're going to get the estimates from these contractors. And now we have a concrete roadmap, concrete scope of work of what needs to be done in order for the repair to be corrected. And we also have dollar amounts associated with that. And again, this is just one contractor's opinion. Another reason why we are letting the sellers know right away what follow-up inspections are happening, what's going on with the home itself, delivering those inspection reports promptly. You know, the sellers also have the right and have the opportunity to call their own people in as well. So at the same time that we're getting our contractors in there, a seller has the opportunity to get their own contractors and get their own opinions as well. So now we've got, you know, what's material to the buyer. We've got these estimates now that we can work from to help inform how we are going to respond to the seller. So now point 3, we are going to get ready to draft an amendment. And I always, I put this note in here, negotiate first. We want to encourage you guys, you know, when we're talking about the inspection contingency, you know, our first rule of thumb always is to attempt to negotiate with the seller first. You know, there might be something, you know, so scary to a buyer that they want to skip straight ahead to the serving a notice of defects, which we're going to get to. But our first line of attack, are, you know, being proactive about this, is to negotiate first with the seller, attempt to negotiate first with the seller via an amendment. We never know how a seller is going to respond. They might be more than happy to fix whatever repair, whatever scary repair a buyer wants to see done before they're comfortable moving forward. Do we have any questions?
To the KW Command 66-day challenge, 3.0 day 9. Apology, yesterday's video is saying.
Mute you guys. All right.
I'd like to add in something with people now writing offers without an inspection, or say limiting how they define a defect under a certain amount of repair, cost of repair. That's why this stage is really important, to get those estimates in during this negotiating time. Because you are going to have to use that cost of repair as part of your negotiation. Mm-hmm. Use it as a defect or not. So,
right. And
the other caution is, when you're getting estimates, keep in mind that a lot of these contractors it's their business. It's what they get paid for. Yeah. And a lot of times.
So this.
Yeah, so the idea is you have to keep in mind that maybe a expert in that, in a roof, or an expert in the foundation may be better than just getting a contractor for a roof or a contractor for a foundation. They're not always available, but those, you might get a better estimate or a better idea of what the repair really is.
Yeah, there are definitely situations where it would call for like a higher level expert. Engineers, for example, or chimney inspections, which generally cost money. And in the offer to purchase, it does state that buyers are typically on the hook, or not typically, buyers are responsible for responsible for the costs of all inspections. So those are definitely conversations that you want to have with your buyers as well. All points of discussion that should be happening again at buyer consultations. Want to put another plug in for the importance of doing buyer consultations to kind of discuss that process. All right, now, So negotiations of the results noted in the inspection report. So we are doing this with an amendment only. We are not using a notice of defects. In our amendments, we are detailing how, who, when, and what is required that the buyer wants to see done to the property before they are comfortable moving forward. And Joni made this comment or put this line in there, whether they are defects or not. So, you know, we don't necessarily have to limit ourselves to what or how the inspector categorizes a defect when it comes to making these requests. A buyer can ask for anything of the seller. It's just how the seller will respond will inform whether or not they happen. So the seller has the right to send back his own amendment once he receives our amendment on what he is agreeing to repair. A line that I really love when I'm having these discussions with the buyers on how a seller can respond, I always say a seller can agree to some, none, or all of what we request. And then it will come back to you, Mr. Buyer, on how you want to respond. You might be okay with some of the things that the seller has not agreed to and be comfortable moving forward. All of these might be deal breakers, right? So just by us making the request, though, the seller cannot kill the deal. They can just say no, and that's as simple as that. So I put in an example here of a amendment that I put together on a transaction that I had last fall. So in this inspection amendment, so I wrote at the top, seller at seller's expense shall have the following repaired prior to closing. And then I wrote paid invoices and lien waivers to be provided no later than 3 days prior to closing. And this was a good example, I thought, because I had a scope of work done. I had a follow-up inspection on a roof, from a roofer. And in this, we explicitly stated that we wanted these roof repairs done per the scope of work from the estimate. But then we also specifically asked that we wanted this specific contractor to perform the roof repairs. Sometimes I see it's more often that we'll just get a scope of work from a contractor, and a buyer will say they want the repairs done per that scope of work. Seller may choose the contractor. So that is also another point of conversation with your buyers. Mr. Buyer, is it this roofer that you want explicitly to do the work? Or are you okay with the seller choosing the contractor, as long as it's done per the scope of work that we provide to the seller. So again, all conversations to have with the buyer. Point number 2. So this was an example of, we did not have an electrician go into the home to give an estimate for this, but the buyer wanted to see these things fixed. But we just wrote that we wanted a licensed electrician to add an outlet to an upper bathroom and secure a light and ensure that the power to the back exterior outlet was working. So again, it was a conversation back with a buyer. These things were small enough that we didn't feel the need to have an electrician come out and give any estimate on it. And we're just letting the seller know, we don't care who you choose, they just need to be licensed, and we want to see these things fixed. Same with these minor plumbing issues, licensed plumber to assess and correct the following plumbing concerns. And then we just listed how it was worded in the inspection report. So I just took verbatim how it was written in how the condition was described in the condition report and added it to this amendment. There was point number 4, there was a furnace repair done on this home between accepted offer and the time that we had the inspection. This is a good example to show that we want to make sure that we are receiving that paperwork and that we're not just relying on the seller's word that this furnace repair was happening. So again, this is just a kind of to show that we want to be as clear as possible with the seller with what we want, and get everything down in writing. So provide scope of repair, paid invoice and lien waiver for a furnace repair made on, and I knew what date it was happening, and any subsequent days needed for repair. So I wanted to see the trail of everything that led up to that furnace repair. So I went one step further and made that statement. And then point 5, closing cost credit of $1,500 shall be provided to buyer at closing. So this can show you guys that these inspection amendments, these requests, these can come in many different forms on how they are repaired. So with this closing cost credit, I believe in this example, there was a set of stairs that needed to be rebuilt. And I think I had asked a carpenter friend, like, you know, what would you charge for this, right? So I didn't have anything written down, it was verbal, but we used that to help inform that $1,500 closing cost credit. And that we might have been lumping some other smaller things in there as well. But when we are making these requests, the conversations with the buyers are always, you know, we've got these estimates and we've got prices associated with the cost of these repairs. Maybe the way to resolve this for the buyers actually with a closing cost credit altogether. Maybe it is with a price reduction if it's big enough work, and maybe the buyer is okay with taking care of it after closing. Maybe the seller, you know, after seeing a request like this, they might have responded and said, you know what, I'm okay with helping to correct all of these things, but I'd rather do it with a purchase price reduction versus taking care of it before closing. So all of these repairs can be negotiated in a number of ways. So again, price reduction, having the work done prior to closing, closing cost credit, which again, a closing cost credit versus a purchase price reduction is more meaningful to a buyer, just because that's that much less closing costs that they need to bring to the closing table. And that actually means actual cash in hand versus a reduced mortgage payment through a purchase price reduction. So I'm always trying to get closing cost credits versus a purchase price reduction if there's a loan involved.
Make sure too, you check with the lender on how much you can ask for a closing cost credit.
Yes, so there is a cap. A good guideline is like 3% of the purchase price. But again, that's not set in stone. You have to have a conversation with the lender to find out exactly how much you can use. So again, just a number of ways that all of these repairs can be addressed. And it's not a black and white, repairs have to be done before closing in order for it to happen, in order for it to close. I also want to say, if you guys ever need help with wording on these inspection amendments, please see Joan or I. Again, the key here is just being as specific as possible, to ensure that there's no gray areas. And we don't want anything left for interpretation. Are there any questions regarding that?
Yeah, just one. Is it typically implied if you call out in an amendment that you would like a licensed electrician or licensed plumber to perform a specific repair, is it generally implied that they're going to provide proof to you that it was done, or do you have to specify, please show us receipts or proof?
It's implied in that. I'm going to say that it is, because any work that is done on a home by a licensed contractor in the previous 6 months before something closes needs to be provided to a title company. But we don't want to have anything implied at all ever. So you would definitely spell it out in an amendment that you want to receive the paid invoices and lien waivers. And more so, you want to spell that out so you can put a date on it, like no later than 3 days prior to closing, right? So yeah, don't leave anything implied. But in answer to your question, regardless, any work done on a home by a licensed contractor in that previous 6 months of a home closing does need to be provided to a title company.
With the lien waiver.
With the lien waiver, yes. And that's also a good point to make as listing agents when you are getting ready to list a home, to make sure that you are gathering lien waivers from a seller if they've made repairs prior to us listing their home. So those, even if it's outside the scope of a inspection negotiation, it's still required by the title company. So, if there was a bathroom remodel in that previous 6 months, the seller the title company needs to see that.
I'm sorry, rookie question, but what is a lien waiver exactly?
It is just basically like a promise from a contractor stating that they have been paid and they will not be placing a lien on the home due to any unpaid bills that a seller failed to give. I mean, it's showing that the seller has paid for the work. Contractor is stating, I will not place a lien on this home.
And it's an actual piece of paper that is delivered then to the title company.
Yeah.
Does it say that it's a lien waiver, or is it just saying that it's like a receipt of payment or anything?
It's explicit. It says lien waiver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, any other questions? So again, we're serving these amendments over to the seller. Seller can sign it right away and we're going to closing. Seller can respond and say, I'll do A, B, and C, but not X, Y, and Z. Then buyer has another choice. Or C, the seller can say, I'm not doing any of it. And then it still comes back to the buyer. So if there is that, if buyer if there are deal breakers in there that a buyer is not willing to move forward on, is not willing to move forward and purchasing the home, there's a breakdown in negotiations, then now we get to the notice of defects stage. So again, that notice of defects is kind of that final line in the sand to a seller. If the seller has not been given the right to cure in the transaction, in the inspection contingency, and this notice of defects is served, then the deal is done, offer is null and void, earnest money goes back to buyer. Again, in this climate, I don't know the last time I saw a transaction or an inspection contingency where seller was given the right to cure. So what happens now if seller has been given the right to cure and this notice of defects is sent to the seller? So first, the structure of the notice of defects. So now, we've made attempts to make requests of the seller. We were explicit in how the repair was done, what we wanted to see done, who was going to perform the repair. Now with the notice of defects, it is not as specific as that. So at the top of our notice of defects, we are stating this is a notice of defects to which the buyer objects, and then you're just listing the defects. So here is an example. And actually I added one line. So seller is in receipt of an inspection report from XYZ home inspection company dated X, Y, and Z. I state that first, and then I go on to say this is a notice of defects to which the buyer objects. And then points 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, you're just now going to list all of the defects that the buyer objects to. Again, and you're going to just lift that language from the home inspection report to help guide you with wording.
Well,
And then
I'm sorry, but one thing that some contracts we've had to correct the agent where they really listed per verbatim the wording in the report. That's not how a notice should be written. It should just list the defect that the inspector pointed out as a defect. Sometimes in the report, it'll say, to correct such and such, or to be followed up by licensed plumber, or there are a lot of wordings in the report that should not go onto a notice of defect. So any instruction, any request of who the vendor should be, none of those things should be in the notice. And as Steph says, it is a list only of the defects, no other instruction with it.
I think a good spot to gather that would just be the summary page too. And then on line 27, you're going to attach the home inspection report. So I still always attach the home inspection report to this notice of defects, even though I have already sent off this home inspection report and delivered it. We just want this in an official, we want it attached to the offer officially. So again, really simple. Very simple on the structure of a notice of defects. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So now the seller receives the notice of defects. Again, if the seller has not been given the right to cure, offer is null and void, and we're done. More often than not, though, again, the seller has been given the right to cure. So what happens now? So seller receives this notice of defects, and now a new timeline has kicked in. What I call the election to cure period now has kicked in. So the seller now may respond by, The seller can send a notice to the buyer stating that he elects to cure the defects per the offer prior to closing. And they must do that in that official capacity. It's all spelled out in the inspection contingency. The way that the seller responds to stating that they will take care of the defects listed is by sending their own notice, electing to cure. The seller can send a notice to the buyer electing not to cure the defects. Now the deal is null and void. And then if the seller does not respond at all via notice and that election to cure period timeline expires, that also makes the deal null and void. So it defaults to 10 days in our inspection contingencies. I think a lot of us are tightening up that timeline so that a buyer is not potentially hanging out for 10 days. But I think some of us are putting like 3 to 5 days in that line. Let me know if you have questions about that. But again, it defaults to 10 days for that seller to respond. And then the seller has another option. So the seller can respond with an amendment if the seller wants to repair fewer than the proposed defects, or they can suggest another way to address the problem. So, negotiations can still happen during this phase. Absolutely. It's not black and white that the seller elects or not elects. You guys still have an opportunity, buyer and seller still have an opportunity to negotiate these repairs. Oftentimes a notice of defects is served only because we've run out of time in our inspection contingency, and the inspection contingency period was not officially extended. So in order for that buyer to avoid buying the house as is by passage of that deadline, we've got to get a notice of defects out to kick in that other timeline. And then buyer and seller will further negotiate on those repairs. So, and this is a very important note. So if the buyer does agree to the amendment, so if this amendment was proposed after the notice of defects was delivered, the amendment must indicate that the notice of defects is withdrawn, because then this stops the clock of the seller's right to cure. And now the amendment directs the seller on how to repair for closing. I think that's my last slide. Is yeah, so it is the inspection contingency, and negotiating the inspection contingency is the hardest part of an offer, hardest part of the transaction. And that's why it is done within, it's the first contingency that we have to address and get out of the way. But we can't stress enough, as buyer's agents, that we need to be doing our due diligence when it comes to the inspection contingency. And what I mean by that is, making sure that buyer is completely informed of the repairs and how repairs need to be remedied. I think this is really important, and insofar as where the follow-up inspection comes into play. I've had buyers who have received, and this is a real life example, I've had buyers receive a $30,000 scope of work, in chimney repairs and tuck pointing repairs on a brick home. And they loved the house so much that they were willing to move forward even after the seller said no to repairing it. And I just, I was shocked, but I just said, okay, as long as you know what you're getting into, go for it. I mean, that saves you guys from any post-close disputes. And a seller or a buyer coming to us after closing and saying, you didn't help me through this, right? So we just, as buyer's agents specifically, we just really need to be on top of making sure that the buyer is well informed when it comes to the inspection and repairs. Are there any questions?
Steph, I think it was either you or Joan that mentioned that at the initial buyer consult, that maybe some of this is even kind of addressed or kind of, did I hear that right? Is there something that we should be kind of sharing the what if with a buyer and just to see, how they might feel about this? Or I thought I was hearing one of you say that we should at least be bringing this concept up at the initial buyer consult.
Oh, yes. So like at your buyer consultations, I'm going through the offer process and I'm spending a lot of time on the inspection contingency itself. And letting them know, when it comes to follow-up inspections, there might be some follow-up inspections that call for extra level of expertise. So calling in an engineer, paying for a chimney inspection that involves cleaning. So Mr. Buyer, I just want to prepare you for that cost as well in case that does come up. We want to learn if there's going to be a $10,000 foundation repair through a $500 engineering report to help us negotiate with a seller, or to help making sure that you understand that there's that $10,000 repair before you go through with the closing. So I also state that we can make attempts to ask a seller to pay for a follow-up inspection. That definitely can be worked out. But I like to kind of put it in worst case scenario that, as a buyer, you should expect to be on the hook for those reports if they are needed. But it will save you a ton of money if we learn something really bad. So it's all kind of under this notion of like what costs they can expect during the transaction. So that's
Thank
what
you.
I was saying. Yep.
I think the buyer consultation is so critical, and as Steph said, explaining the whole inspection contingency to them. First of all, it gives them a sense of ease that they're not buying a house that they don't know anything about. It will teach them a lot about the house. It will also give them a way to null and void the contract if there are things that they can't accept. But just talking about it when it's not the issue at hand, talking about it as this is what can happen. Just explaining things like an inspection is going to be about 3 hours or 3.5 hours.
Mm-hmm.
If they're a first-time buyer, they're surprised that really is a long inspection and a very detailed inspection. So explaining those things up front and reducing the amount of anxiety about what this part of the contingency is, that's my role as your agent, as your buyer's agent, to help guide you through this very difficult part of the transaction. But to also make it clear that this is not a way to renegotiate the price of the house. And in this market that we're in, which is very competitive and people are writing over the list and over the list and over the list, they end up with a house that they realize they've paid a lot of money for, and then they think that they can renegotiate that by asking the seller to reduce the purchase price or to cut back on or repair some things. And in the buyer consultation, I would stress that point very strongly, that is not what the inspection contingency is for, to recoup some of your costs. It is basically to fix things that are discoverable in the report, and so that you can move forward. But it is a negotiation fact. It's not a demand. So.
Yeah.
So how long have we kind of been in this market where inspections are being waived? I mean, I would imagine, has it been a couple of years now that it's typically been waived?
Yeah, I'd
Okay.
say we're going on year 2 or in
Okay.
Year 3, actually.
year 3. Yeah.
Okay. So I would imagine that even experienced agents are probably a little rusty at this component of.
I would say where seasoned agents are rusty is when it comes to right to cure and giving right to cure and knowing how that plays out. Because for so long, we just didn't have to. There was no need for it, you know. So, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Joan and I make this comment all the time. I mean, whether you're seasoned or brand new, I mean, the inspection contingency always trips people up, always. So it's a lot.
Yeah, call us ahead of time or while you're still discussing the choices with your buyer, rather than calling us after everything and then say, how do we get out of this? Or how do we resolve this?
Yeah.
So remember that Steph and I, and also the hotline, are available for agents when you're concerned about writing this amendment for the inspection or writing the notice of defect. So that we can be there for you before you send that over. I mean, we just got a notice of defect. It was from another agent in another firm. And they literally had taken the summary page of the report, cut and pasted all the inspector's comments and issues with all the defects and put them on the notice of defect. And it was so egregious. I called the broker of that company and I said, you know, our seller really cannot read this notice of defect the way it's written, because it included all kinds of instructions and all kinds of demands and everything beyond just listing the defect. And that broker just kind of blew it off. I mean, he was saying, well, that's what they wrote. And so we just returned it with an amendment trying to clear it up. But, you know, this kind of creative offer writing is getting a little out of control with some places.
Were you able to clear it up? I mean, did your amendment, were you successful?
Yeah, what happened was the seller was cooperative and took it with a grain of salt. So looked at just the defects and not all the instructions and everything. He ended up saying he wasn't going to cure them all. He sent back an amendment saying he was going to cure certain things, but that buyer didn't want to accept that. So the deal did fall apart. But, you know, a lot of it was the fault of the buyer's agent not knowing how to write or draft a proper notice of defect, which led to the buyer and seller just not being able to cooperate at all.
So this is a recent example, isn't it?
Yes.
So I find it curious that in this market where inspections are generally waived, that in fact that they did have an inspection that they included. So can you share with us kind of like why it worked in that instance, or, you know, why an inspection
I wouldn't
was?
say everybody's leaving off the inspection contingency. I would say there's still quite a few offers that have the inspection contingency in them. What a lot of the agents are doing are putting a cap on the cost of what they'll call a defect. And that's a good way to have an inspection, but also to assure the seller that you're not going to come at them with the whole list of defects that may be small and immaterial. So at least it's a way to incentivize the seller a little bit, but also the buyer to get an inspection. And I certainly agree with that. I mean, I've seen so many situations of post-closing lawsuits and arguments and everything with a buyer finding out what's really wrong with his house, who has skipped a inspection contingency and really is sitting there owning a house with a lot of problems and a lot of costs. And I'm totally against leaving off an inspection contingency unless it's, you know, the buyer is very willing to understand or has the wherewithal to pay for any costs that come up or can perform them himself. but certainly not anything for a first-time buyer, certainly not anything for somebody that doesn't have a lot of money, that they might end up with a house with a lot of expensive problems.
Anybody else? Thank you for the question, Sarah.
Mhm.
Okay. I think next week we have another guest speaker. I think we're having Jared from MLS actually, so that'll be good. So we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
want to clear up the confusion between what you can do with delayed listings and what you could do with excluded listings.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Okay.
guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Steph. Nice job.
Bye.